There is a system in the human body that makes no sound, generates no electrical impulses measurable by an electrode, has no valves that open and close with the heartbeat, and yet, without it, the entire body would collapse in a matter of hours. The curious thing is that for centuries, medicine almost completely ignored it. Renaissance anatomists dissected cadavers with extraordinary meticulousness, identified nerves, arteries, and organs with millimeter precision. And yet, they passed by certain structures without realizing they were standing before one of the most powerful systems in the body. The reason is simple. This system doesn't communicate with electricity or movement. It communicates with molecules, silently through the bloodstream. And its messages can take minutes, hours, or even years to fully unfold. It's called the endocrine system, and its anatomy reveals something profound about how life works. To understand what the endocrine system does, you first have to understand what it doesn't do. It's not the nervous system. It doesn't conduct electrical signals along specialized fibers that travel from one point to another in fractions of a second. The nervous system is like a telephone network. The signal arrives quickly, directly to the recipient. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is more like a radio transmitter. It sends a chemical signal into the bloodstream, and that signal travels throughout the body until it finds the appropriate receptors. Only the cells with the correct receptor respond. The rest simply let the message through. This seemingly technical difference has enormous consequences for human biology. The molecules that the endocrine system releases into the bloodstream are called hormones. The word comes from the Greek hormon, which means to set in motion or excite. This is an apt description. Hormones are signals that initiate, stop, accelerate, or modulate biological processes in organs that may be located a considerable distance from where they originated. A hormone produced at the base of the brain can alter the metabolism of every cell in the body. A hormone secreted by a tissue in the abdomen can change heart rate, blood pressure, mood, and concentration. This ability to act at a distance, to coordinate functions in separate organs, is what makes the endocrine system the body's great conductor. But before understanding how it conducts, it's helpful to know who the musicians are. The endocrine system doesn't have a single central organ. It's made up of a collection of glands and tissues dispersed throughout the body, each with specific functions, but all integrated into an extraordinarily precise network of chemical communication. At the base of the brain, nestled deep between the hemispheres, lies the pituitary gland. It is small, measuring no more than 1 centimeter in diameter and weighing less than 1 gram. Yet for a long time, it was called the master gland of the endocrine system because many of its hormones control the activity of other glands in the body. The pituitary gland produces, among others, growth hormone, which regulates the development of bones and muscles from childhood to adulthood. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal glands, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which regulates the thyroid gland, and several hormones related to reproduction. But to call it simply the master gland is, as 20th century scientists discovered, a considerable oversimplification, because just above the pituitary gland, connected to it by a thin stalk of nerve and vascular tissue, lies an even smaller structure, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is, in functional terms, the real director. Although it is part of the brain and has its own neurological functions, it also acts as an endocrine gland. It releases hormones that travel directly to the pituitary gland through a system of specialized blood vessels. And these hormones tell the pituitary gland what to release and in what quantity. The hypothalamus, in turn, receives information from virtually every part of the brain: body temperature, blood glucose levels, light-dark cycles, stress levels, and hunger signals. It integrates all this information and translates it into hormonal signals. In this sense, the hypothalamus is the point where the nervous and endocrine systems merge into a single regulatory network. This fusion has profound consequences that only began to be understood in the second half of the 20th century. It means that thoughts, emotions, and external stimuli are not purely psychological phenomena. They have a biochemical basis that directly impacts hormones. Prolonged stress, for example, is not just a subjective experience. It's a signal that the hypothalamus interprets as a hormonal cascade, ultimately releasing cortisol from the adrenal glands. This disrupts the immune system, blood pressure, fat and protein metabolism, and even memory. Chronic anxiety leaves measurable biochemical traces. This understanding gave rise to a field known as psychoneuroimmunology. which studies precisely how the brain, endocrine system, and immune system communicate, and the results continue to be surprising. But let's return to anatomy. If you trace the brain down the neck, you reach the thyroid gland. It is a butterfly-shaped structure that surrounds the front of the trachea, with two lobes connected by a central isthmus. The thyroid gland weighs between 20 and 30 grams in an adult, and its main function is to regulate metabolism. It does this by producing two essential hormones, thyroxine, also known as T4, and triiodothyronine, or T3. These hormones act on almost every cell in the body, controlling the rate at which they consume oxygen and produce energy. When the thyroid gland produces too many hormones, metabolism speeds up. The person loses weight, feels hot, their heart beats faster, and their nervous system becomes overactive. When the thyroid gland produces too little, the entire body slows down. Fatigue, weight gain, a constant feeling of cold, and cognitive slowness occur. These two conditions, hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism, eloquently illustrate how much the body's daily functioning depends on a single gland. Behind the thyroid, embedded in its posterior surface, are four tiny structures that for a long time went completely unnoticed by anatomists. These are called parathyroid glands. They are so small that they were often mistaken for part of the thyroid, and for decades they were accidentally removed during neck surgeries, without anyone realizing what they were missing. The consequences only became apparent when operated patients began to develop unexplained seizures and severe muscle spasms days after surgery. The cause, which took years to identify, was the abrupt drop in blood calcium levels. The parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, which is the body's main regulator of calcium. Without it, blood calcium levels plummet, and since calcium is essential for muscle contraction and nerve transmission, the result is chaotic activation of the neuromuscular system. Calcium, that mineral we usually associate with bones, is actually a crucial signaling molecule in almost every tissue in the body. Continuing the anatomical descent, we reach the pancreas. This organ has a dual nature that makes it unique in human biology. Most of its tissue is exocrine. It produces digestive enzymes that are released into the small intestine to break down food. But interspersed within this tissue, like small islands, are the islets of Langerhans, and it is in these islets that the endocrine function of the pancreas resides. These cell clusters produce two critically important hormones, insulin and glucagon. Insulin is produced by beta cells and allows glucose from the bloodstream to enter cells to be used as energy. Glucagon, produced by alpha cells, has the opposite effect. It stimulates the liver to release glucose when blood levels are low. The interaction between these two hormones keeps glucose levels within a very narrow range, and the failure of this mechanism is precisely what defines diabetes mellitus. Type 1 diabetes involves the autoimmune destruction of beta cells. Type 2 involves progressive tissue resistance to the action of insulin. In both cases, the consequence is the same. Glucose does not reach the cells adequately, and the body enters a state of metabolic deprivation, despite having abundant fuel in the blood. The adrenal glands sit atop the kidneys, two flattened pyramid-shaped structures that, despite their small size, produce hormones essential for survival. Each adrenal gland has two functionally distinct regions, the cortex on the outside and the medulla on the inside. The adrenal cortex primarily produces three types of hormones: glucocorticoids, of which cortisol is the most important, which regulate the metabolism of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and modulate the inflammatory response of the immune system. Mineralocorticoids, especially aldosterone, which regulate the balance of sodium and potassium in the kidneys, directly affecting blood pressure. And adrenal androgens, which contribute to the development of secondary sexual characteristics in both sexes. The adrenal medulla, for its part, produces adrenaline and noradrenaline, the hormones of the fight or flight response. When the brain perceives a threat, it activates the hypothalamus, which in turn activates the autonomic nervous system. This system stimulates the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline within seconds. The heart rate increases, the bronchi dilate, glucose is mobilized from the liver, and blood flow is redirected from the digestive organs to the muscles. The entire body prepares to act. This emergency mechanism, perfectly designed for situations of immediate danger, becomes a problem when it is chronically activated by modern stressors, such as work pressures, relationship conflicts, or financial insecurity. The biology of stress doesn't distinguish between a predator and a deadline. In the reproductive system, the organs also have essential endocrine functions. The testes produce testosterone, an androgenic hormone that regulates the development of male sexual characteristics, sperm production, muscle mass, bone density, and certain aspects of behavior. The ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, which regulate the menstrual cycle, the development of female sexual characteristics, pregnancy, and bone health. But these hormones do not act in isolation. They are part of a complex axis that includes the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and which is under constant hormonal feedback. The menstrual cycle, for example, is not simply a monthly reproductive event. It is an extraordinarily precise hormonal choreography where the release of estrogen stimulates the pituitary gland to release luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation, which in turn triggers progesterone production, preparing the uterus for implantation. If fertilization does not occur, hormone levels drop and the cycle begins again. Disruption of any link in this chain can alter fertility, metabolism, bone density, mood, and cardiovascular health. There are lesser-known structures that are also part of the endocrine system and that remain shrouded in mystery for years. The pineal gland, for example, is a small protuberance in the center of the brain, entirely surrounded by nerve tissue. During antiquity and the Renaissance, philosophers like René Descartes considered it the seat of the soul, partly because it is the only unpaired structure in a brain that is fundamentally symmetrical. Today we know that the pineal gland produces melatonin, the hormone that regulates circadian rhythms. Its production increases in darkness and is suppressed by light, especially short-wavelength blue light. This is why exposure to screens at night suppresses melatonin and makes it difficult to sleep. It's not a matter of habits or willpower, but of circadian biochemistry. Melatonin also has effects on the immune system and cellular aging, although research in these areas is still ongoing. Adipose tissue, for decades considered simply a passive energy storage system, was recognized in the 1990s as an active endocrine organ. Fat cells, or adipocytes, produce leptin, a hormone that informs the hypothalamus about the body's energy reserves and regulates appetite. They also produce adiponectin, which improves insulin sensitivity, and resistin, whose function is still being investigated. Understanding adipose tissue as an endocrine tissue radically changed how medicine understands obesity. Obesity is not simply the result of overeating. It is partly an endocrine disorder in which the hormonal mechanisms regulating appetite and energy expenditure are disrupted. Studies suggest that in people with severe obesity, leptin signaling can become resistant, meaning the hypothalamus does not properly receive the satiety signal, creating a vicious cycle that is difficult to break. Even the heart, which is typically studied as an organ of the cardiovascular system, has endocrine functions. It produces natriuretic peptides, hormones that regulate blood pressure and sodium excretion by the kidneys when the heart chambers detect an increase in pressure. The gut produces ghrelin, known as the hunger hormone, which signals the brain when the stomach is empty, as well as several postprandial peptides that modulate satiety. The liver produces insulin-like growth factors. The kidneys produce erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow. The endocrine system has no clear boundaries. Its components are scattered throughout virtually every organ in the body, and the distinction between endocrine gland and tissue with endocrine functions becomes increasingly blurred as research progresses. What makes the endocrine system truly remarkable, beyond its dispersed anatomy, is the precision of its regulation. Most hormonal axes operate through negative feedback. This means that when a hormone reaches sufficiently high levels in the blood, that same signal inhibits the release of more hormone. It's an elegant self-regulating mechanism. The system controls its own output. The hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis is a clear example. When T3 and T4 levels in the blood rise, these hormones signal the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to reduce the production of signals that stimulate the thyroid. When levels fall, this inhibition is lifted and production resumes. The result is a hormone concentration that fluctuates within a narrow range, adapted to the body's needs at any given time. But hormones don't simply fire signals and wait. Their action within the cell depends on specific receptors, and the expression of those receptors can change. A cell can become more or less sensitive to a hormone, depending on how many receptors it expresses on its surface, or how many it has inside. This adds a huge layer of complexity. The effect of a hormone depends not only on its concentration in the blood, but also on the sensitivity of the target tissues. Insulin resistance is the best-known example of this phenomenon. In this state, the pancreas produces insulin normally, or even in increased amounts, but muscle and liver tissues don't respond adequately because they have reduced the expression or effectiveness of their insulin receptors. The signal is present, but the antenna isn't receiving it properly. Endocrine disruptors are an emerging threat that scientific research has been exploring since the last decade of the 20th century. They are chemical substances, natural or synthetic, that can interfere with the endocrine system because they have a molecular structure similar to hormones and can bind to hormone receptors, inappropriately activating or blocking them. Among the most studied are bisphenol A, present in certain plastics, phthalates used as plasticizers, and organochlorine pesticides. Evidence suggests that exposure to these substances, especially during fetal development and childhood, can disrupt hormonal development with effects that manifest years or decades later. Research in this field continues, and there is still no complete consensus on the exposure levels that pose a significant risk to human health. There is something that the anatomy of the endocrine system reveals that goes beyond biochemistry and physiology. It reveals that the human body is not a sum of parts working in parallel. It is a system of systems where each component is in constant communication with the others, adjusting its activity based on signals from distant organs and conditions that change from second to second. The endocrine system is, in that sense, the language in which the body speaks to itself. Not with words, but with molecules. Not with rapid impulses, but with sustained messages that unfold over time. And when that conversation is interrupted, when a gland malfunctions, when a receptor stops listening, when a hormone is produced in excess or deficiency, the imbalance manifests not in a single organ, but in the entire organism. The history of the endocrine system in medicine is also the story of how human beings learned to listen to that conversation. They learned to measure hormones in the blood with techniques that did not exist a century ago. They learned to replace those that are missing, such as insulin for type 1 diabetics, a therapy that transformed a rapidly fatal disease into a manageable condition. They learn to block those that are produced in excess, as in certain endocrine tumors. And they continue to learn to decipher the signals they still don't fully understand. The interactions between the gut microbiome and metabolic hormones. The epigenetic mechanisms by which stress in one generation can influence hormone expression in the next. And the relationship between circadian rhythms and the risk of metabolic and cardiovascular diseases. The endocrine system lacks the visible spectacle of the heart, which can be seen beating, and the architectural expanse of the nervous system, which can be mapped out like a network of circuits. Its organs are small, silent, and dispersed. Its messages are invisible to the eye, and its language requires highly precise instruments to be deciphered. And yet, it coordinates the growth, metabolism, reproduction, stress response, sleep, appetite, and mood of every human being from the moment of conception to the last heartbeat. Life, in all its adaptive complexity, is partly a hormonal conversation that never stops. And when it finally does, it does so silently, in the same way it has always spoken. Every hormone circulating in your blood right now is part of a conversation that has been perfecting itself for millions of years. The endocrine system isn't a secondary mechanism of the human body, it's its silent architecture, the invisible thread that connects every organ, every cell, every vital function. Understanding how it works is understanding something essential about what it means to be alive. If this journey through the anatomy of the endocrine system has given you a different perspective on your own body, please consider liking and subscribing to Revealed Anatomy, where each installment seeks to do exactly that. Reveal the extraordinary complexity that lies beneath the surface. MA.